I'll talk about something kind of very, very useful to know is breathing techniques. You'll probably see me breathing a lot and wondering why I'm breathing funny. Anything in life, archery, shooting guns, all that stuff, they'll always teach you to breathe when you're pulling the trigger or whatnot. Tattooing, it's the same way. If you're doing something that's stressful and you really have to pull it off perfectly, kind of like shooting a perfect arrow, breathing really helps. Helps your mind be free, it relaxes you, and those two things make your tattooing ability stronger. That's not something you'll hear a lot of people talk about, but it's really important. A lot of times when you're in an area, I call it like a really tough area. Maybe the lines have to intersect exactly like the picture. You'll see me look back and forth a lot. It's just to make sure that I got it correctly before I pull the trigger and commit to a line. Keep in mind, this definitely isn't an amateur video. It's definitely not meant for people that are just starting to tattoo or just learning how. Definitely not meant for people that are apprenticing. It's meant for people that have been tattooing for years and have already understood the basic fundamentals of doing black and gray tattoos. Just because in this video I'm not going to teach you how to fade or shade. That's something you have to already know how to do to bring to the table to do a portrait. Also keep in mind, portrait tattoos are the most difficult tattoos you can do, and it's not something you want to do to somebody unless you know what you're doing. I mean, me as a portrait artist, I can't say that I've never done a portrait without it not being perfect, but there's times where when you're learning, it's not going to be as good as 5 years into the tattoo career. But keep in mind, you want to do as much practicing as you can on paper to even understand the fundamentals of a portrait, which is something I did. Before I ever did a portrait tattoo, I had been drawing portraits and I understood how they were done before I tried tattooing one. So if this is something you're going to attempt to do, just make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. You're not trying to do portraits just to be cool. You're not trying to do portraits just to say you've mastered one of the hardest parts of tattooing. You're doing it because you love portraits and you really want to learn how to do them right. There's a lot of years that go into doing a portrait correctly, a lot of advice. Two of my favorite portrait artists are Jack Rudy, of course, and Bob Tyrrell. And both have sort of different styles, but they both nail the portrait. Another technique I use is zooming in and zooming in again. And what that means is when you're referencing, you're zooming in mentally, looking really deep and detailed at the portrait reference. But then you're looking beyond that. You're zooming in and you're zooming in again. You're going into the detail factor so deep that it helps you pull off the portrait exactly like the picture. I'm going to say that probably 100 times in this video, exactly like the picture. Because remember, that's what makes a portrait a portrait. It's got to be exactly like the picture. Only one way to do a portrait, the right way, exactly like the picture. Otherwise, what you have is an attempt at a portrait. And remember one thing, if you're doing a portrait on somebody, they're expecting you to do it and pull it off. They're expecting you, they've trusted you with their skin, they've trusted you with their parents, their kids, their deceased loved ones. Whatever portrait you're doing, they've trusted you with it. It's a very important spiritual experience to get someone's face on you. So when someone allows you the privilege to do a face on them, you don't want to sell them short. You don't want to convince them that you're a good portrait artist when you're not. And there's nothing wrong with not being a portrait artist. There's nothing wrong with not being a good portrait artist. as long as you learn before you attempt it and cover your bases. Once again, learning how to do it on paper first. Taking classes, getting videos. Good place to go for that would be airbrushaction.com. It's the website for Airbrush Action magazine. Great magazine. A lot of featured artists in the airbrush world that are really good. Look out for some videos by Corey St. Clair, and another good video out by Steve Driscoll. That guy can do portraits so detailed that he almost never leaves out the hair follicles or the sweat glands on a face. So that's something to know. Remember, you want to zoom in and zoom in again when it comes to portraits. You want to get really detailed. One thing I'd like to bring up, I said before, if you haven't started doing portraits on the skin, or even if you have and you're not happy with the end result, I would just urge you to pull back and to stop doing them until you've really took the time to get some videos and to get some instruction, because ultimately you don't want these people coming back 2-3 years from now wanting to get touched up or fixed up, and it's real hard to fix a portrait. It's almost impossible. Only way you can fix a portrait is if it faded so much that you can't even really see the first one. So just be real mindful of that. Don't be greedy, don't be selfish, and what I mean by those words is, if you're selfish and greedy and you know you can't do a portrait good or how you want it to be, you're going to just be out there attempting to do them, and that's not fair. It's not fair for your own reputation, let alone is it fair for the client who's probably paying you for the portrait. So there's nothing wrong with stopping. I did it myself. There's nothing wrong with stopping your portraits, going back to the drawing board and perfecting it on paper, understanding the elements of it, and then returning to the skin. And maybe you want to start off with what I always suggest to the people that I work with, or anyone that asks me about portraits. Once you get the fundamentals of a portrait down, don't even jump into a face portrait of a family member of somebody. Jump into a portrait, maybe a character from a horror flick, like you know, Frankenstein or something. Something like that, to where if it doesn't come out exactly like the picture, it's Frankenstein. There's a bunch of wrinkles and cracks on his face, so no one really will ever know, especially if you've already got the fundamentals of tattooing down. So you basically start doing those types of portraits first, and then when you feel comfortable, then you can jump into a face of a family member or somebody that's exact. You know, even an actor like Robert De Niro or Alfred Hitchcock, he's an exact person. There's no Frankenstein elements to him. So you want to save these types of portraits to after you've been experimenting with characters. And portrait tattoos aren't for everybody. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't necessarily do a lot of color. I don't do colored portraits. I don't think I'll ever even attempt to do a colored portrait. As far as I'm concerned, Nico and Mike DeVries, those guys are the masters at it. There's a few more people out there, but as far as I'm concerned, Nico and Mike DeVries, they're the first ones I've seen do the color portraits perfect. So I'm going to leave it up to them. There's no need for me to even jump into that right now. I'm going to stick to black and gray and leave the other stuff up to the masters. And believe me, those guys are the masters. In fact, if you Google Nico, N-I-K-K-O, or you Google Mike DeVries, D-E-V-R-I-E-S, those are some people to study as well. Look at their work online and check it out. It's some pretty crazy stuff. It almost makes me never want to do color tattoos again. The reason why I'm not talking about my techniques that I'm doing right now, as far as my shading, like I said, and I'll say it again, it's really important that you have the basics down. Really important that you have the basics of tattooing and pulling off gray. For example, if I was to do a scale from black to light gray, and that's all I was doing, I could pull that off, even if I didn't know how to do portraits. So should you. You should know how to get the perfect transitions. If you're doing a Sacred Heart, you're doing a skull, anything, know how to do the perfect transitions before you attempt to do a portrait, because all a portrait is nothing but perfect transitions. Off camera I did a little bit more of the black, but before I finish this little area I want to bring something up that's really, really important. A lot of times people do black, and what they do is they'll do this whole area the same tone. Maybe a little bit darker over here. They'll do this area the same tone, but when you're looking at your reference, you got to realize that it's not all black. It's all tones. One way to always check yourself constantly to make sure you pull it off right is you relate your tones always. So this is a blacker line. This is probably a 100% black line. It kind of goes up to like a 90, 80, 70% black in this area. And then the table he's leaning on, it's not black, but there's parts of it that are a 90% black. You just want to zoom in and zoom in again, like we talked about. Just zooming in, getting every single thing you see on, even the little nooks and crannies. Because, I mean, there's sort of a tiny reflection in this table. And I'm just going to capture what I see. Not what I think I see, but what I see. And it's going to, the end result's going to be that it looks just like the picture. In this table there's darker shadows. And yeah, like I said, a lot of people just do one or two tones to pull what they think they see, and they're not really looking deep into the tattoo and the reference. So just always look super deep into it and just do what you see and break it down and break it down again. This whole portrait is 1,000 different portraits, and right now I'm doing a portrait of the table. So since I'm doing a portrait of the table, I'm going to pretend that that's the only thing I'm doing today. I'm going to lock myself out of everything else, and I'm just going to do a portrait of the table. So remember, it's a portrait of a table, not a table. If it was a table, I could do it my way and how I want, but it's a portrait, so we're going to do exactly like we see it. And we're going to spend time on it. We're not going to just get it done like a lot of people would. Constantly looking at the reference, constantly comparing it to the other light sources. Sometimes you get locked in on an area and you're so locked in on it that by the time you're done it's too late. You did it too dark or too light, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. So you're constantly comparing the table to this black, the table to that black, the table to that tone. And it's real simple. You look at the picture and you say, is this darker or lighter than that? Okay, it's kind of like connect the dots. Once I've done this area, I've concentrated just on this area, this sets up how this is going to look. I look at the reference, I say this is about that tone. So I'm referencing from that tone. It's really important to set yourself up and cross-reference enough to make you have a headache when you're done. If you have a headache when you're done with the portrait, you're doing good. It's kind of like being on the computer for 4 hours. And every subtle detail of the black you want to capture. For example, it goes black, 90% black, and then sort of like a 30 to 40% gray, back into a 50 to 60% gray here. A lot of people will just do black from there to there, and one tone of gray from there to there. Now what that makes it is a decent portrait, or almost a portrait. And remember, there's no such thing as an almost portrait. It's got to be exactly like the picture to be pulled off correctly. So you want to break it down. You know, I'm looking at the reference, I'm realizing that this area is darker right through there. So I'm just going to do what I see. It's really, really easy. Once you learn how to do the basic fundamentals, you do only what you see. This right here, this where the coat meets the glass, there's a darker bend of reflection. I'm going to capture that. As the coat dips into where his tie would be, it's darker. Right where the end of the coat meets his face, it's almost pitch black, but just a small little line. What you have at the end of it all is a nice portrait. Remember, this is a portrait of just that area. I mean, literally, when I say zoom in, there's a little part on here where it's a little bit sharper of a transition, and there's a little bit of another shadow right there, just so slightly. Never overdoing anything. You can always pull back and look at it. There's nothing wrong with pulling back. In fact, sometimes pulling back is what makes you not overdo a tattoo. a portrait tattoo anyways. Once again, just want to reiterate the fact that this might look easy, just like the other day seeing Tony Hawk skateboard on TV. It looked kind of easy the way he was skateboarding, doing these crazy tricks, but ultimately if I try to do that, I'm going to fall on my ass because it's a trick. It just looks easy. And to him it is easy. To me this, I wouldn't say easy. I could pull it off, and I know that I'll pull it off. And relatively it's easier than when I first tried to do a portrait, but ultimately it's not easy, and it might look easy just for the simple fact that it's going smoothly, we're trucking along, but there's a lot of techniques that you have to memorize to make it look easy and then for it to be easy. One of the techniques that you always have to remember, and I'll say it again, is you're constantly cross-referencing what you're doing. Like I said before, this is 1,000 portraits, all in one portrait, so we're constantly not locking ourselves into anything. As I'm locking myself into this part of the sleeve, I'm not really locked into it. It just looks like I am. I'm concentrating on it, but in the back of my mind, I'm referencing how this relates to this, how this meets the finger, how this meets the white under t-shirt. You're just constantly, your brain is constantly thinking when you're doing a portrait. You're constantly, and that's another reason why when you do a portrait, you know, everyone's got their own preferences. If they like to, you know, do anything extracurricular while they're tattooing, that's on them. I'm not going to judge anybody, but one of my main beliefs is that you do a portrait sober. This stencil, like I said before, it's still hanging in there with us. It's still making it possible to shade up against the lines, which is really important when you're doing a technique like this where you're just using the shader to start out with. You really need these stencils to stay. And you know, some people, there's talk about a stencil as being a cheating technique. Well, when it comes to the actual portrait tattoo, you want your stencil to be perfect, because your whole time, I mean, you literally have to be a genius. If there's people out there that think they can pull a portrait off without using a stencil, I would sure love to get a copy of it and see it, because actually I'd have to see the video to really believe it, because when you're doing a portrait on skin, the skin bends. The skin, you know, it's not like a canvas, it bends, it's different. You want to definitely just lock in your stencil and follow those lines, and believe me, there's no cheating when it comes to doing a portrait tattoo. That's why a very small percentage of people, tattoo artists, will ever be able to get it down. So there's no cheating at all when it comes to making a stencil. In fact, that's definitely one of the main parts of pulling this off correctly, is getting that stencil perfect and leaving it on. Let's zoom in again. As this jacket sleeve folds into the other side, there's a little bit of a darker shadow as it meets. It's such a subtle thing to even notice, but we want to get all the subtleties. That's what makes a portrait stand out, award-winning. That's what makes a portrait get you more portraits. Okay, as I'm coming in where the back of his jacket meets the front of his hand, or actually his arm, coming in once again with the whole angle of the needle, going for a single needle / 3 tight on this one. That's what it's equaling right now. Just working the angle, just working the tip. Okay, once again we're going to talk about our setup. I like to use the Pelican for the reasons I mentioned before, that they're just a lot more easy to work in the skin. Seems like the ink is broken down thinner and finer, and that's how it was put to me by Jack, Rudy, and Bob Tyrell, which they kind of influenced me to use it too, and I definitely see the benefits of it. So I have my all black ink as the first cup, and these two started out as just water, and I'm going to constantly keep changing them. But what I do is, this is of course my pure black, but when I want like a 90% gray, I'll dip it in the water with the machine running one time really quick. That's change it to about a 90 to 80% black, and then 70, 60, 50, 40. The more you dip it and the more you bring it to the skin is when it makes it to be the gradients that we need. I'd say after about 20 minutes of tattooing, this actually becomes a 50%. And when it becomes a 50% and I'm working an area on the face or the hands and I need a 30 or 20% black and gray, instead of dipping into here and then going into here until I get to 30, it's way easier for me to dip into this 50% black and then knock it down over here with the water, 40, 30, 20% black, and then I'll start tattooing. I now switch to the outliner machine. What we were talking about earlier about doing the details, like the fingers and the glass and even the face later on, we're going to start to pick away at it with the outliner machine. A lot of people talk about using a single needle, and I started my first 3 years in the tattoo world with a single needle, and that works good too. It can take a little bit longer. Also, you got to realize that this, although it's an outliner, it's a 1205 RL, which basically is a tight outliner, but I'm using it like a shader. So that's why I'm going to be using this for the next probably 20-30 minutes or so on the glass, just picking away at the detail. And if you just want to watch the way that I go about it, it's somewhat similar to how you would shade anything with even a mag, but keeping in mind it's just a small needle to just pick away at the detail. The reason why I choose a 1205 over a 3 tight or another small needle is that I find that sometimes when it's a smaller needle, it can kind of make the skin scar a little bit and heal bad the more times you go over it. When it's a bigger needle like a 1205, you seem to have a little bit more leeway with the skin and how it heals. But this needle right here just literally lets you focus and zoom in on the smallest detail. Now, just to reiterate, all these small details matter, especially when you have a portrait you're doing. You know, you want to show this piece to your friends and you want the people to be impressed, so you want to pick away ever so slightly using this technique with shading with the smaller needles is something that I kind of been doing for the last 3 years, and it's kind of stepped up my portrait game pretty heavily on the final product and how it looks. It's just it makes a difference. Small details do make a difference. And also too, I want to point out, if you're wondering why I'm not using the tip of the other machine, like I was talking about for quite a while, sort of talking about how you can get a single needle from that one, and as to why now am I using this one if that one uses a single needle. One important thing to think about is when you're going to be working an area like this, which is consumed a big part of the tattoo, you don't want to be having to use the sides of the machines for that long of a time. You want to get a different machine, different needle to tackle the job. Whereas before, when I was going into the corners with the sides of the shader, it's just a little bit here and then I'm back to my regular use of the shader, a little bit here. Whereas this piece right here is practically done entirely with the small needle. So we're going to stick to this for a little while. Also too, one of the main reasons why I like using the rotary is because it's so quiet. I mean, imagine shading the whole entire tattoo with the sound of this in the background. It kind of gets annoying after a while, especially when you've been spoiled with the rotary for so long. But I find the rotary to be a little bit too hard on the skin for outlining, so that's why I switched to this one for the shade or for the outlining. I use the regular outlining machine. Kind of makes it fun to switch back to the shader after doing this one because this is a lot noisier.